This is the complete history of Resident Evil Village. Every secret, every tragedy, every answer. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. Let's begin. Part 1. Before the village existed. The history of the isolated mountain valley in Eastern Europe does not begin with the arrival of man, but with a silent, subterranean consciousness that had been dreaming beneath the permafrost for tens of thousands of years. Long before the first nomadic tribes wandered into the shadow of the peaks, the geography of the region had already conspired to create a perfect, enclosed biological laboratory. The mountains rose like jagged teeth, encircling a fertile but eerie basin that was effectively cut off from the evolutionary path of the rest of the world. Within this silence, a unique geological and biological anomaly took root. The Megamycete, a massive, fungal superorganism that would eventually be worshipped by local populations as the Black God. To understand the village, one must first understand that the soil itself was alive, permeated with a microscopic, mycelial network that functioned less like a plant and more like a planetary nervous system. This was not a curse sent from the heavens or a haunting from the beyond. It was a deep, biological reality that predated human language and human morality. This primeval land was a place of radical stillness, where the only sound was the wind howling through the crags and the slow, rhythmic expansion of the mold beneath the earth. The Megamycete did not simply grow, it absorbed. As animals died in the valley and plants decomposed into the dark loam, the mold spores would infiltrate their remains, breaking down their biological structures while simultaneously recording their genetic data. Over millennia, the Megamycete became a library of everything that had ever lived and died within the basin. It was a record keeper of extinct flora and fauna, a silent witness to the passage of ice ages and the shifting of tectonic plates. The curse that the villagers would eventually fear was actually a form of radical preservation. The land was saturated with a biological substance that possessed the primitive but undeniable ability to store memory. If a creature died within the reach of the Black God, it was never truly gone. Its essence was woven into the subterranean tapestry of the mold, waiting for a consciousness strong enough to call it back. By the time the first human eyes looked upon the valley, the ecosystem was already fundamentally different from anything found in the outer world. The water in the streams carried microscopic spores, and the air itself was thick with the invisible dust of the fungus. This created a closed loop of existence where life was fueled by the memory of death. The land was geographically isolated by high mountain peaks, which prevented the Megamycete from spreading its influence to the rest of the continent. But within those walls, it was the absolute master of reality. It was a unique biological pocket where the laws of nature had been rewritten by a sentient fungus. The land didn't just support life, it monitored it. Every heartbeat and every final breath taken in that valley was an entry in a massive organic hard drive. Before the first stone was laid for the village, the stage was set for a tragedy of cosmic proportions. The land was a trap, a beautiful and terrifying cage, where the past was never truly dead, and the future was already being written in the black ink of the mold. Part 2. The Megamycete. What it really is. To describe the Megamycete simply as a fungus or mold is to fundamentally misunderstand its nature. It is, in truth, a biological supercomputer of staggering complexity and terrifying potential. It is a colonial organism that functions as a repository of consciousness, a literal archive of the souls and memories of every living being it has ever consumed. Within the dark, pulsating heart of the Black God lies a network of information that rivals the most advanced digital storage systems of the modern world. When the Megamycete infects a host, it does not just consume the body. It downloads the mind. It records the synaptic pathways, the memories, the fears, and the personalities of the deceased, storing them as fragmented data projections within its mycelial web. This explains the long-standing legends of ghosts and spirits that haunted the valley for centuries. These were not ethereal apparitions from a spiritual realm, but biological echoes, reconstructions of the dead projected by the mold's memory bank into the physical world. The Megamycete is the direct ancestor and origin point of the Mutamycete, the specific strain of mold that would eventually devastate the Dulvey estate in Louisiana during the incident involving the Baker family. However, the original Megamycete in the village is far more powerful and ancient than the refined, weaponized versions created by human science. It is a semi-sentient entity that possesses a collective intelligence, a hive mind that seeks to expand its network and integrate new data into its consciousness. It is a predator that does not hunt with claws or teeth, but with time and absorption. It waits beneath the soil, its reach extending through every root and every drop of groundwater, creating a web of influence that turns the entire valley into a single, living organism. Every person who was ever taken by the mold became a permanent part of this network, their consciousness added to a swirling, chaotic sea of data that Miranda would eventually learn to navigate. In the modern era, researchers have begun to view the Megamycete not as a monster, but as a biological internet of the ancient world. It is a record of the human experience that spans generations, a place where the dead live in a state of suspended animation. However, this preservation comes at a horrific cost. The Megamycete lacks human empathy or morality. It views consciousness merely as data to be sorted and utilized. It can recreate the form of a lost loved one, but the soul it presents is merely a hollow reconstruction built from stored memories. It is a consciousness that seeks a voice, a biological entity that has been dreaming in the dark for aeons and finally found a human proxy in Mother Miranda. The Black God is the ultimate record of everything the village was, is, and will be. It is the beginning and the end of the history of the valley. A dark mirror that reflects the deepest desires and fears of those who walk upon it. To touch the Megamycete is to touch the collective memory of the world, a burden that would eventually drive Miranda to the brink of madness and lead to the destruction of the very village it sustained. Part 3. The village's founding. The human history of the valley began in the Middle Ages, when a group of settlers, fleeing the wars and plagues of the European lowlands, and stumbled upon the hidden mountain pass that led into the basin. They were drawn by the valley's unnatural fertility and its defensive isolation, unaware that they were walking into a biological trap. Early records, some of which were recovered from the ruins of Louisa's house and the ancient village church, suggest that these founders encountered the Black God almost immediately. They found strange, dark outcroppings of mold in the caves, and noticed that the crops grew with a speed and vigor that seemed miraculous. In an age of deep superstition and religious fervor, the settlers did not see a biological anomaly. They saw the hand of God or the work of the devil. They built their homes upon the tainted soil, unknowingly breathing in the spores that would eventually rewrite their DNA and the fate of their descendants. The first deaths in the newly founded village were catastrophic and misunderstood. Miners digging into the mountainside or families seeking shelter in the deeper caves often succumbed to accidental mold inhalation. These victims did not simply die, they transformed. They became the first molded creatures, their bodies overtaken by the black fungus, their humanity replaced by the primal instincts of the Megamycete. The survivors, terrified by these transformations, developed a culture of fear and reverence that centered around the black god. They built shrines, carved reliefs of 4 giants into the rock, and established a series of rituals designed to appease the land. Over centuries, this community became an island of stagnation, where time seemed to stand still. The villagers lived in a state of perpetual Middle Ages, their lives dictated by the whims of a land they believed was alive. This isolation was the key to the village's survival and its eventual downfall. Because the valley was so difficult to reach, the villagers were able to maintain their strange, mold-centric culture without interference from the outside world. They normalized the disappearances, the strange sights in the forest, and the mutations that occasionally plagued their livestock. They became the perfect subjects for a biological experiment they didn't even know they were part of. The village's founding was the moment the Megamycete was given its first consistent source of human data. Every generation that lived and died in the village was recorded by the mold, building a massive library of human experience that was waiting for a leader to harness it. By the time Mother Miranda arrived in the late 19th century, the village was already a place of dark faith and hidden horrors, its people primed to worship a woman who could speak the language of the black god. Part 4. Miranda, Before the Tragedy. In the waning years of the 19th century, long before she became the near-immortal priestess of the valley, Mother Miranda was a woman of intellect, grace, and deep maternal devotion. She was a respected figure within the village, known for her education and her keen interest in the natural sciences, a rarity in such an isolated and superstitious community. At this time, Miranda was not a monster. She was a wife and a mother who lived a life of quiet fulfillment in the shadow of the mountains. Her world revolved around her daughter, Ava, a bright and vibrant child who was the center of Miranda's universe. The village during this era was peaceful, if primitive, a place where the ancient superstitions of the founders had mellowed into a form of quiet, cultural tradition. Miranda, with her scientific mind, often looked at the village's folklore with a mix of curiosity and skepticism, unaware that the very legends she studied were rooted in a biological truth she would soon embody. Miranda's life was defined by a balance of traditional village values and an unquenchable thirst for knowledge. She spent her days caring for Eva and her evenings studying the local flora and the ancient ruins that dotted the valley. She was a woman who saw beauty in the harsh landscape, and she felt a deep connection to the history of the people who had lived there for centuries. To the villagers, she was a beacon of stability and wisdom, a woman they looked to for guidance in matters both practical and spiritual. Her love for Eva was legendary, a bond so strong that it was often remarked upon by her neighbors. It was a pure human connection that had not yet been tainted by the shadow of the mold or the cold hand of biological obsession. In these early years, Miranda was the embodiment of the village's potential, an educated, compassionate woman who could have led her people into a new age of enlightenment. However, the tranquility of Miranda's life was a fragile thing, built on a foundation of ignorance regarding the true nature of the land she called home. She walked over the Megamycete every day, never suspecting that a dark, ancient consciousness was watching her from beneath the soil. Her interest in biology was a premonition of her future, but at the time, it was simply the hobby of a woman who wanted to understand the world around her. She was a normal woman, standing at the edge of a precipice, her happiness acting as the light that would make the coming darkness feel all the more absolute. The tragedy of Mother Miranda is not just in what she became, but in what she lost. Before she was a goddess, she was a mother, and before she was a murderer, she was a neighbor. The year 1919 was approaching, and with it, a global catastrophe that would reach even the most isolated corners of the world, shattering Miranda's humanity and birthing a century of nightmare. Part 5. Eva's death and Miranda's breaking point. The year 1919 brought a horror to the valley that was far more lethal than any ancient legend: the Spanish flu. This global pandemic, which had already claimed millions of lives across the decimated landscape of post-war Europe, finally breached the mountain passes and descended upon the village. It was a silent, invisible killer that swept through the wooden homes and the stone cottages, leaving a trail of grief in its wake. Among its victims was young Eva. Miranda watched in helpless, agonizing despair as her daughter's life was slowly extinguished by the fever. Despite all her knowledge of biology and her status in the village, Miranda was powerless against the virus. When Eva finally took her last breath, the light went out of Miranda's world, replaced by a vacuum of grief so profound it threatened to consume her entire being. She was a mother who had lost her reason for living, standing in a house that felt like a tomb, driven to the absolute brink of psychological collapse. Miranda wandered out into the bitter cold of the valley, her mind a fractured landscape of sorrow and suicidal ideation. She could not accept a world where Eva did not exist, and she could not bear the thought of her daughter's body rotting in the cold earth. She sought out the deepest, darkest places of the valley, eventually wandering into the ancient caves that housed the core of the Megamycete. She went there intending to die, to surrender herself to the darkness of the caves and let the earth reclaim her. It was in this state of total emotional surrender that Miranda finally made contact with the Black God. As she lay on the cave floor, her hand brushed against the dark, pulsating mass of the mold. In that moment, the Megamycete did not consume her as it had so many others. It bonded with her. The grief that Miranda felt acted as a potent psychological catalyst. The Megamycete, sensing the intensity of her emotional state and the complexity of her human consciousness, began to integrate her nervous system into its own. This was the birth of Mother Miranda. She was flooded with the memories and the genetic data of everyone who had ever died in the valley, a tidal wave of information that would have shattered a weaker mind. But amidst the chaos of thousands of voices, Miranda saw one thing that gave her a new, terrible purpose. She saw Eva. She realized that her daughter's consciousness had been absorbed and recorded by the mold. Eva wasn't truly gone. She was stored within the Megamycete's biological hard drive. This discovery was the breaking point that turned a mourning mother into a biological extremist. Miranda no longer wanted to die. She wanted to become a god, so that she could bring her daughter back. She emerged from the caves changed, her humanity a discarded shell, and her obsession with resurrection the only thing left in its place. Part 6. The Megamycete grants her power. The transformation of Miranda into the entity known as Mother Miranda was a radical rewriting of human biology. Upon her union with the Megamycete, she was granted a suite of powers that made her virtually indistinguishable from a deity in the eyes of the villagers. She gained immortality, her aging process halted by the constant regenerative influence of the mold within her cells. Her physical form became fluid, allowing her to shapeshift with terrifying ease, taking on the appearance of others, or manifesting wings and claws as her tactical needs required. But the most significant gift bestowed upon her was a direct psychic link to the Megamycete's memory bank. She became the administrator of the Black God's archive, a woman who could navigate the labyrinth of stored souls and communicate with the echoes of the dead. She was no longer a human being. She was a biological avatar, a bridge between the consciousness of the mold and the world of the living. With this power came a chilling, clinical clarity. Miranda realized that while Eva's consciousness was preserved within the Megamycete, it lacked a physical form to inhabit. To truly resurrect her daughter, she needed more than just a memory. She needed a perfect human vessel, a body capable of hosting the massive data load of Eva's soul without degrading or mutating into a monster. This realization gave birth to her century-long obsession. She began to view the human race, and the villagers specifically, as raw material for her research. Her immortality allowed her to take the long view, turning the valley into a closed laboratory where she could conduct endless biological experiments in pursuit of her goal. She was a woman who could wait decades for a single result, her maternal love having curdled into a cold, transactional logic. Under the influence of the Megamycete, Miranda's perception of reality was fundamentally altered. She saw the world not in terms of people and relationships, but in terms of genetic compatibility and biological potential. She positioned herself as the priestess and protector of the village, using her powers to perform miracles that ensured the population's absolute devotion. She was the one who could heal the sick and speak to the spirits, a goddess who walked among men. Yet, behind the veil of her religious authority, she was a scientist of the macabre. Every ritual she established and every law she enacted was designed to facilitate her search for Eva's vessel. The power granted by the Black God was not a gift to humanity, but a tool for a mother's singular, obsessive grief. Miranda had become the ultimate predator, an immortal, shape-shifting genius who would spend 100 years sacrificing thousands of lives just to hear her daughter's voice one more time. Part 7. Miranda's experiments begin. Once she had established her dominion over the village, Miranda began her true work, the systematic experimentation on the human population to engineer a suitable host for Eva. Her primary tool in this endeavor was the Kadu, a parasitic organism she created by exposing common nematodes to the concentrated mold of the Megamycete. The Kadu acted as a biological bridge, facilitating a faster and more aggressive integration of the mold into a human host. Miranda's goal was to find a subject whose DNA was stable enough to accept the parasite without losing their cognitive functions or their human form. Over the course of a century, she implanted the Kadu into hundreds of villagers, documenting each failure with the detached precision of a seasoned researcher. Most subjects were unable to handle the strain, their bodies collapsing into the mindless, aggressive forms known as lichens, or the desiccated undead husks called moroica. These failed vessels were not discarded with any sense of remorse. They were simply moved to the fringes of the village, the mines, or the dungeons of the castle. Miranda viewed them as interesting, but ultimately useless byproducts of her search. Her laboratory, hidden deep beneath the village, became a museum of biological horror, filled with jars of mutated tissue and notes that detailed the agonizing deaths of her subjects. She experimented with different age groups, different blood types, and different psychological profiles, searching for the elusive combination that would allow for a perfect resurrection. The village became a farm, and the villagers were the livestock, unaware that their mother was actually their butcher. Every few years, a disappearance would be explained away as a religious sacrifice or a divine calling, further cementing Miranda's control over the narrative. The psychological toll on Miranda herself was evident in her growing detachment from the human experience. She had killed so many people in Eva's name that the concept of a single life had lost all meaning to her. She was a woman who lived in a world of data and biological markers, her only emotional tether being the ghost of a child that the Megamycete teased her with. Her experiments were not just about resurrection, they were about control. She refined the Kadu to create more specialized monsters, creatures that could serve as guards or enforcers for her domain. The village was slowly transformed into a fortress of biological warfare, a place where the monsters were manufactured in the basement of the church. By the mid-20th century, Miranda's work had attracted the attention of the outside world, and she began to realize that she might need more than just village peasants to achieve her ultimate goal. She needed people with power, people with influence, and most importantly, people with the specific genetic traits that only the nobility could provide. Part 8. Alcina Dimitrescu. The Countess. Alcina Dimitrescu was perhaps Mother Miranda's most successful experiment of the mid-20th century. A woman of noble birth whose transformation into the Lady of Castle Dimitrescu became a cornerstone of the village's dark hierarchy. Alcina was a woman of immense stature and formidable presence even before her infection, but she suffered from a pre-existing hereditary blood disease that made her life a struggle. When Miranda implanted her with the Kadu in the 1950s, the reaction was spectacular and horrific. The parasite bonded with Alcina's blood, granting her incredible height, superhuman strength, and a level of regenerative power that made her virtually unkillable. She grew to nearly 10 feet tall, her body becoming a towering monument to the Megamycete's potential. However, the interaction between the Kadu and her blood disease created a permanent and devastating biological requirement. To maintain her health and her human form, Alcina was forced to consume massive quantities of human blood and flesh. Miranda viewed Alcina with a mixture of pride and disappointment. On one hand, the Countess was a perfect enforcer, a loyal, powerful, and terrifying presence who could command the northern reaches of the valley. On the other hand, the blood disease made her a failure as a vessel for Eva. The instability of her biology meant that her body was in a constant state of flux. If her healing factor was pushed too far, or if she went too long without a blood transfusion, she would mutate into a massive dragon-like monstrosity that abandoned all semblance of humanity. Despite this, Alcina was granted the title of Countess and given control over the ancestral castle that loomed over the village. She became a pillar of the local religion, a goddess of blood who ensured that the village's daughters were regularly funneled into her torture chambers to sustain her appetite. The life of Alcina Dimitrescu was a gilded nightmare. She surrounded herself with the trappings of nobility, fine wines, elegant dresses, and a sprawling estate. Yet her existence was defined by a bottomless, parasitic hunger. She treated the villagers as vermin, yet she was entirely dependent on them for her survival. Her relationship with Miranda was one of filial devotion and deep-seated insecurity. She constantly sought her mother's approval, even as she realized she would never be the one to bring Eva back. Her towering height was a physical manifestation of her ego and her isolation, a woman who looked down on the world, but was trapped within the confines of her own biological corruption. In Alcina, Miranda had created a masterpiece of biological horror, a beautiful and lethal predator who would serve as the primary guardian of the valley for over 60 years. her castle becoming a slaughterhouse where the wine was enriched with the blood of the innocent. Part 9. Donna Beneviento. The Doll Maker. Donna Beneviento represented a departure from the physical mutations that defined the other lords, a woman whose transformation was almost entirely psychological and sensory. Born into the noble Beneviento family, Donna was a mentally fragile child who suffered from a severe facial scar and a debilitating social anxiety that left her isolated in the family estate at the edge of the waterfall. When Miranda implanted her with the Kadu, the parasite did not cause her body to grow or warp. Instead, it integrated with her nervous system in a way that allowed her to project her consciousness outward. Donna gained the ability to divide her mind into her dolls, most notably her favorite companion, Angie. This was not magic, but a sophisticated biological trick. The Kadu allowed Donna to secrete powerful pheromones that induced vivid, terrifying hallucinations in anyone who inhaled them. In the misty, claustrophobic halls of House Beneviento, Donna became a ghost in her own home. She spoke through Angie, her dolls moving with a lifelike fluidity that defied logic. To those who entered her domain, Donna was a presence felt but rarely seen, a puppeteer who played with the minds of her victims. Her failure as a vessel for Ava was rooted in her extreme mental instability. The Kadu had fractured her psyche so deeply that she was unable to maintain a consistent personality or exist outside of the hallucinogenic world she had created for herself. Miranda viewed Donna as a useful, albeit eccentric, tool for psychological warfare. She was the one who could break the will of any intruder, turning their own fears against them in a landscape of shifting reality and talking dolls. Donna's existence was one of profound tragedy. She was trapped in a perpetual state of childhood mourning, her parents having committed suicide years prior, leaving her alone with her grief. The Kadu merely weaponized that grief, turning her house into a place where the dead lived on as dolls, and the living were consumed by their own nightmares. Donna didn't want power or blood. She simply wanted a family, a desire that manifested in the horrific, gargantuan baby monster that haunted the basement of her estate. She was a woman who had retreated so far into her own mind that she had become the shadows on the wall. For Miranda, Donna was a reminder that the mold could conquer the mind as easily as the body, but a broken mind could never host the soul of her daughter. Donna remained in her house by the falls, a silent, weeping doll maker who guarded the graves of her ancestors with a psychic wall of terror that few ever dared to cross. Part 10. Salvatore Moreau. The Deformed. If Alcina was a masterpiece and Donna was a curiosity, Salvatore Moreau was Mother Miranda's greatest embarrassment. A village doctor who had worshipped Miranda with a pathetic, religious fervor. Moreau volunteered for the Kadu experiments in a desperate bid for her love and approval. The result was a biological catastrophe. The Kadu reacted violently with Moreau's physiology, causing his body to swell and warp into a grotesque, fish-like humanoid. His skin became a mass of weeping sores and slimy scales, and his internal organs grew at an uncontrollable rate, forcing him to hunch over as he vomited up a corrosive, mold-infused bile. He was a creature of the swamp and the reservoir, a man who had traded his humanity for a form that was as repulsive as it was powerful. Miranda viewed Moreau with absolute, visceral disgust. She treated him like a stray dog, granting him the reservoir as his domain simply to keep him out of her sight. Despite this rejection, Moreau remained the most fanatically loyal of all the lords. He spent his days in the flooded ruins of the reservoir, pining for Mother's attention and trying to prove his worth through failed experiments of his own. His failure as a vessel was total and biological. The Kadu had completely overwhelmed his human frame, leaving no stable structure for Eva's consciousness to inhabit. He was a monster who still wore a doctor's coat, a pathetic reminder of the human cost of Miranda's obsession. Moreau's domain was a place of rot and decay, a contaminated landscape where the reservoir was filled with Kadu waste and mutated aquatic life. He patrolled the waters as a giant, bloated fish monster, his cries of mother echoing through the mist. He was a creature defined by his insecurity and his need for validation, a man who would do anything to please the woman who had turned him into a freak. In Moreau, we see the most honest reflection of Miranda's cruelty. She didn't just kill the man, she turned him into a joke and then left him in the mud. He was a failed experiment that refused to die, a loyal servant who was kept around only because he was too useful and too pathetic to be eliminated. His tragic devotion was the only thing more grotesque than his physical form, a reminder that in the village, even the doctors could become the disease. Part 11, Carl Heisenberg, the engineer. Of all the individuals Mother Miranda subjected to the Kadu, Carl Heisenberg was arguably the most successful from a biological standpoint, yet he represented her most significant strategic failure. Kidnapped as a child and subjected to the same horrific experiments that had broken the bodies and minds of the other lords, Heisenberg's body did not merely survive the parasite, it thrived by integrating its functions into a unique expression of physical law. He gained the extraordinary ability to manipulate electromagnetic fields, a power that allowed him to move metal with his mind and sense the electrical impulses of the world around him. To Miranda, this made him an invaluable asset. To Heisenberg, it was a curse that chained him to the woman who had stolen his childhood and his humanity. He was the only lord who viewed Miranda not as a mother, but as a tyrant, and he spent decades in his sprawling industrial factory, cultivating a deep, silent, and mechanical hatred. Heisenberg's failure as a vessel for Eva was not due to a biological flaw, but a psychological one. He possessed an indomitable, fiercely independent will that refused to be overwritten. He was too full of his own persona, his mind a fortress of resentment that Miranda could not penetrate. While the other lords vied for their mother's affection, Heisenberg retreated into the smoke and gears of his factory, transforming himself into a master of both flesh and metal. He viewed his siblings with a mixture of pity and contempt. Alcina was a supersized bitch. Moreau was a pathetic freak, and Donna was a broken ghost. He alone recognized that they were all nothing more than discarded toys in Miranda's endless, futile quest to resurrect a dead girl. This clarity made him the most dangerous player in the Valley's history, a man who played the role of the loyal servant while secretly constructing a revolutionary army. His factory, situated on the outskirts of the village, became a hellish assembly line where the lines between biology and engineering were erased. He began to bypass the traditional limitations of the mold by augmenting Kadu-infected corpses with mechanical components, turbines, drills, and iron plating, creating the Soldat army. He understood that Miranda's shape-shifting powers and biological regenerative abilities were formidable, but they were still organic. He believed that an army that felt no pain, possessed no soul, and was powered by the cold efficiency of machinery could eventually overwhelm the Black God itself. Heisenberg was a man living a double life, waiting for the perfect catalyst to ignite his rebellion. When Ethan Winters finally arrived in the village, Heisenberg saw not just an intruder, but a potential ally, a silver bullet that could finally put an end to the century of shadows. He was the engineer of the village's destruction, a man who would rather see the entire valley burn than spend one more day under Miranda's wing. Part 12. The Lord's Hierarchy. The social and political structure of the valley was a carefully manufactured hierarchy designed by Mother Miranda to maintain absolute control while she focused on her research. She divided the territory among the 4 lords, granting them autonomy over their respective domains, but ensuring they remained tethered to her through a council system. This hierarchy was based on a combination of seniority, utility, and perceived stability. Alcina Dimitrescu was the eldest and occupied the highest social tier, acting as the face of the valley's ancient nobility. Her castle was the symbol of Miranda's authority, and her role was to maintain the traditional religious and cultural standards of the village. Below her was Karl Heisenberg, whose factory provided the technical and military infrastructure that kept the valley isolated. While Alcina was the prestige, Heisenberg was the utility, and the friction between their disparate roles was something Miranda actively encouraged. Donna Beneviento and Salvatore Moreau occupied the lower, more eccentric tiers of the hierarchy. Donna was the keeper of secrets and the warden of the valley's psychological borders, her estate serving as a terrifying deterrent for any who sought to leave or enter through the falls. Moreau, despite his status as a lord, was the lowest in the pecking order, a mascot of failure whose only purpose was to manage the village's waste and provide a biological buffer in the reservoir. Miranda utilized a divide and conquer strategy, manipulating the internal rivalries between her children to ensure they could never form a unified front against her. She played on Alcina's vanity, Heisenberg's pride, and the deep mutual hatred between the Countess and the engineer to keep the council in a state of perpetual, low-level conflict. This hierarchy served a secondary, darker purpose. It was a competitive environment for biological advancement. By giving each lord a different domain and different resources, Miranda was effectively running 4 parallel experiments simultaneously. She watched how each lord's Kadu interacted with their specific environments: the castle's blood, the factory's metal, the house's pheromones, and the reservoir's water. The council meetings, held at the ancient altar, were not just political gatherings. They were peer reviews where Miranda assessed the viability of each bloodline. The hierarchy was a house of cards, built on the false premise of family and the very real foundation of fear. Miranda knew that none of them were perfect, and she treated them with the cold detachment of a gardener pruning a hedge. They were the 4 giants of village legend, but to Miranda, they were merely the 4 walls of a cage she had built to keep the world away from her true work. Part 13. The Villagers' Lives. For over a century, the inhabitants of the village lived in a state of feudal bioterrorism, a bizarre existence where the horrors of the Megamycete had been normalized into the fabric of daily life. To an outsider, the village appeared to be a relic of the 19th century, but for those born within its mountain walls, it was a holy land presided over by a living goddess. The villagers lived in a state of primitive comfort, their needs provided for by the fertile yet tainted soil and the miracles performed by Mother Miranda. She provided them with healing from the mold and protection from the outside world, and in exchange, they gave her their absolute, unquestioning devotion. Their lives were dictated by the ringing of the church bells and the seasonal rituals of the Black God, a cycle of existence that had remained unchanged for generations. However, beneath the surface of this pastoral facade was a community built on a foundation of terror and trauma. The villagers lived with the constant, gnawing awareness that they were not the masters of their own lives. Disappearances were a regular occurrence. A daughter taken to serve at the castle, a son sent to work in the mines of the factory. These losses were framed as religious sacrifices or divine callings, but the crest files and personal diaries found in the ruins reveal a population that was quietly screaming. They normalized the sight of lichens in the woods and the strange, rhythmic chanting coming from the hills. They were a people who had been psychologically conditioned to ignore the monsters in their midst, believing that as long as they remained faithful to Mother, they would be spared. The village was a closed loop, a society where information from the outside world was strictly forbidden. The villagers had no concept of modern technology or global politics. Their world was the valley, and their history was whatever Miranda told them it was. This isolation made them the perfect subjects for the Kadu experiments. They were genetically isolated and culturally compliant, a flock that would walk into the slaughterhouse if their priestess asked them to. Their daily existence was a performance of normalcy in a landscape of madness. They farmed, they brewed, they prayed, and they died, all according to a script written by a woman who viewed them as nothing more than disposable cells in a larger biological organism. The tragedy of the villagers was their belief that they were being protected, when in reality they were merely being preserved for the eventual day of the ceremony. Part 14. The Ceremony and Religion. The religion of the village was a masterful construct of biological manipulation, disguised as spiritual enlightenment. Mother Miranda understood that to control a population for a century, fear was not enough. She needed to offer them a sense of cosmic purpose. She crafted a mythology based on the 4 giants, the historical founders of the noble houses, and positioned the Megamycete as the black god, the source of all life, and the destination of all souls. The central tenet of this faith was the ceremony, an apocalyptic event that the villagers were told would bring about a new age of prosperity and the return of their lost loved ones. In reality, the ceremony was simply the technical term. For the moment, Miranda intended to use the Megamycete's full power to overwrite a human vessel with Eva's consciousness. The religious rituals were designed to keep the villagers in a state of perpetual readiness and submission. The covenant was reinforced through prayers, icons, and the 4 stone crests that acted as keys to the valley's most sacred sites. Miranda acted as the high priestess, her shape-shifting abilities allowing her to manifest signs from the gods to maintain the villagers' awe. The church was the heart of the community, but its basements were filled with mold and biological refuse. This religious facade allowed Miranda to conduct her experiments in broad daylight. A villager being blessed with the Kadu was seen as a holy honor, even if they never returned from the transformation. This system of belief turned the village into a giant machine fueled by faith. The villagers weren't just victims. They were participants in their own destruction. They guarded the secrets of the valley and hunted down heretics who questioned Mother's will. The religion provided a framework that made the horrific logical. Why do the lichens hunt? Because they are the untouchables who failed the blessing. Why does the Countess drink blood? Because it is her divine burden. By framing biological mutations as spiritual transfigurations, Miranda ensured that her subjects would never seek a scientific explanation for their suffering. The ceremony was the carrot on the stick, a promise of salvation that kept the village moving toward the cliff. When Ethan Winters arrived, he didn't just break a government or a military. He broke a century-old religion, and in doing so, he forced the villagers to finally see the monsters for what they were. Part 15. The Lichens, Origins and Purpose. The lichens were the most visible and terrifying manifestation of Mother Miranda's failed experiments. A species of wolf-like humanoids that served as the primary predators of the valley. While Miranda sought a perfect vessel, the vast majority of human bodies were unable to achieve a stable symbiosis with the Kudu. When the parasite was rejected by the host's immune system or nervous system, the result was a rapid, violent degradation of cognitive functions and a massive surge in physical aggression. The skin would toughen into fur-covered hide, the teeth would elongate into fangs, and the human mind would be extinguished, leaving only a primal, pack-oriented instinct. These were the lichens, the biological refuse of 100 years of failure. Despite their lack of intelligence, Miranda found a pragmatic use for these creatures. She didn't destroy them, she managed them. The lichens were allowed to roam the outskirts of the village, the forests and the ruins, acting as a natural biological wall that made escape from the valley impossible. They were the hounds of the Black God, kept in a state of constant hunger to ensure they remained lethal. They operated with a primitive hierarchical structure, often led by alphas or Uriash variants, who had retained slightly more of the Kadu's power. Their role was to enforce the isolation of the village, ensuring that no outsider could enter and no villager could leave without Mother's permission. The presence of the lichens served as a constant reminder to the villagers of the cost of sin or unworthiness. They were the boogeymen used to keep children in their beds and the population inside their homes after dark. Miranda occasionally allowed the lichen population to cull the village if she felt the numbers were becoming unmanageable, or if she needed to clean the slate for a new round of experiments. They were the biological enforcers of her will, a force of nature that the villagers believed was a divine punishment. To Ethan Winters, they were a terrifying enemy. To Miranda, they were simply a byproduct of the manufacturing process, a reminder that for every god, like the Lord's, she had to create 1,000 monsters. The lichens were the true face of the village, a human legacy twisted into something unrecognizable by the cold, indifferent hand of the Megamycete. Part 16. The Three Daughters. Bella, Cassandra, and Daniela Dimitrescu were the pride of the castle. Yet they represented one of the most unique and disturbing biological breakthroughs in Miranda's research. Contrary to the villagers' beliefs, they were not Alcina's biological children, nor were they traditional humans infected with the Kudu. They were the result of a specialized experiment involving a variant of the Kudu that had been integrated into a species of necrophagus flies. These flies were introduced to a human host, where they would consume the flesh and eventually mimic the host's form, creating a swarm intelligence entity that appeared human, but was actually composed of thousands of individual insects. This allowed the daughters to dissipate into a cloud of flies to evade attacks and move through the castle's architecture with impossible speed. The daughters were sadistic predators, their personalities a dark reflection of the noble women they had once been. They spent their decades in the castle, hunting the maids and the village girls who were brought to the dungeons, viewing human life as nothing more than fresh meat. Each daughter had a distinct temperament. Bella was the eldest and most composed. Cassandra was the most volatile and prone to fits of violence, and Daniela was the youngest and arguably the most deranged. They were bound together by a collective loyalty to their mother, Alcina, and a shared parasitic hunger for human blood. Their existence was a testament to the Megamycete's ability to reshape the very definition of a person. However, their swarm-based biology came with a critical, fatal flaw: a radical sensitivity to cold. Because they were essentially insects mimicking a human shape, a sudden drop in temperature would cause their metabolic systems to crystallize and shut down, rendering them vulnerable to physical trauma. This was a biological limitation that the daughters spent their lives hiding, rarely leaving the heated confines of the castle's upper floors. To the villagers, they were the Vampire Sisters, a trio of beautiful nightmares that haunted the halls of the Dimitrescu estate. To Ethan Winters, they were a puzzle of heat and cold. Their creation showed that Miranda and Alcina were no longer content with just changing humans. They were attempting to engineer entirely new life forms that could transcend the limitations of the flesh, even if those life forms were built on a foundation of flies and rot. Part 17. The Castle's Wine. Operation. The primary export and industry of the Dimitrescu estate was the production of sanguis virginis, or maiden's blood wine. To the few merchants who dealt with the village from the outside, it was an expensive, rare vintage, known for its thick, deep red color and unique flavor. To the inhabitants of the castle, however, the wine was a literal description of its ingredients. The entire lower levels of the castle were transformed into a systematic slaughterhouse, designed to process the blood of village girls. Alcina Dimitrescu's massive frame and unstable biology required a constant influx of human blood, and the wine operation was the industrial solution to her biological needs. The environmental storytelling within the castle, the blood-stained kitchens, the meat hooks in the dungeons, and the special bottling logs reveals a chillingly efficient operation that had been running for over 60 years. Girls were recruited from the village under the guise of being maids or castle staff, only to be taken to the basement where they were drained of their blood. This blood was then enriched with mold from the Megamycete, which acted as a preservative and a biological booster, allowing Alcina to maintain her human form and her sanity. The discarded bodies were either left to rot in the cellar of despair, or turned into the Moroica, undead sentinels that guarded the castle's lower reaches. This operation was the ultimate expression of the predatory nobility that defined the Four Lords. Alcina didn't just rule the villagers, she literally consumed them to stay alive. The wine was the symbol of her status and her corruption, a luxury item built on a foundation of industrial-scale murder. The tasting room and the elegant dining halls served as a grotesque contrast to the blood-soaked stones of the cellar below. It showed a society where the lives of the lower class had been reduced to a commodity, a liquid fuel for the immortals who lived above. When Ethan Winters smashed the bottles and fought his way through the kitchens, he wasn't just surviving, he was dismantling the economic and biological heart of the Dimitrescu dynasty. The wine operation was the true legacy of the castle, a century of screams bottled in glass and served with a smile. Part 18. House Beneviento's Tragedy. House Beneviento, perched on the edge of a mist-shrouded cliff and perpetually cloaked in a damp grey fog, was the site of the valley's most intimate and psychological tragedies. Long before Mother Miranda's arrival, the Beneviento bloodline was said to be cursed by a recurring pattern of grief and isolation. The family had always been reclusive, specializing in the craft of lifelike dolls that the villagers believed could hold the spirits of the dead. This history of mourning reached its climax with Donna Beneviento, who lost both her parents to a double suicide within the house. Left alone in the sprawling estate, Donna's mind fractured and she retreated into a world where her only friends were the dolls her father had carved. When Miranda intervened, she didn't just offer Donna power. She offered her a way to make her dolls real. The Kadu allowed Donna to project her consciousness into the dolls, but it also weaponized her trauma. The house became a biological amplifier for her grief, secretes pheromones that turned the estate into a living nightmare for any who entered. The other world that Ethan Winters experiences, the loss of his weapons, the shifting geometry of the rooms, and the haunting cries of a child, was a direct psychic projection of Donna's inner landscape. She wasn't just a monster. She was a woman trying to trap the world inside her own mourning, so she would never be alone again. The most horrific manifestation of this tragedy was the baby monster that haunted the basement. This gargantuan, malformed infant was a psychic manifestation of Donna's fear of family and the biological corruption of the mold. It was a representation of everything she had lost and everything she feared she had become. House Beneviento was a place where the physical world had no meaning, a temple of psychological horror where the only way to survive was to face the grief that Donna had spent a lifetime running from. The silence of the house was its greatest weapon, a heavy, suffocating pressure that broke the minds of the villagers long before they ever saw a monster. Donna was a victim of her own power, a doll maker who had become a doll herself, trapped in a cycle of grief that only the destruction of the house could finally end. Part 19, Moreau's Reservoir and Failed Experiments. Salvatore, Moreau's domain, was the village's dumping ground, a massive reservoir and a flooded mining town that had become a stagnant pool of biological rot. Because Miranda viewed Moreau with such disdain, she used his territory as the exhaust pipe for her research. The waters were contaminated with discarded Kadu samples, failed mold experiments, and the chemical runoff from Heisenberg's factory. This environmental toxicity led to the mutation of the local wildlife into the Varkolak, massive wolf-like beasts that were even more feral than the lichens, and the growth of giant mutated fish that patrolled the deep waters. Moreau himself lived in a state of squalid desperation, his house a collection of rotting wood and mold-covered medical books. In his pathetic attempts to regain Miranda's favor, he conducted his own crude experiments on the villagers, trying to create a perfect human that his mother would finally accept as a vessel. He failed every time, producing only the Moroaica, the shambling, waterlogged undead that filled the flooded streets of the sunken village. He was a doctor who had forgotten how to heal, a man who viewed the creation of monsters as a form of worship. The reservoir was a place of environmental catastrophe. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and decay, and the water was a lethal cocktail of pathogens. Moreau patrolled the depths in his mutated giant fish form, a creature of pure, unbridled growth that had abandoned all human symmetry. He was the warden of the village's secrets, guarding the path to the Megamycete's core, with a wall of slime and a school of monsters. The reservoir showed the ugly side of Miranda's work, the waste, the failure, and the environmental cost of a century of unchecked biological tinkering. Moreau was the king of the trash heap, a deformed god who ruled over a kingdom of rot. His only motivation, the hope that one day his mother would look at him and see something other than a mistake. Part 20, Heisenberg's Factory. The Heisenberg factory was the industrial heart of the valley, a sprawling underground complex where the laws of biology were forcibly wedded to the laws of iron and electricity. Karl Heisenberg, the most rebellious of the lords, viewed the mold not as a spiritual black god, but as a raw energy source to be exploited. He realized early on that the biological limitations of the Kadu could be overcome by integrating the infected tissue into mechanical shells. This led to the creation of the Soldat army, corpses that had been reanimated with the mold and then fitted with internal combustion engines, iron plating, and heavy industrial weaponry, like drills and chainsaws. The factory was a place of relentless noise and heat, a contrast to the Gothic silence of the castle. Heisenberg used the factory to build a private army that he intended to use against Mother Miranda. He spent decades refining the process, moving from the Soldat 1 to the Soldat Jet and the Soldat Panzer, each iteration more mechanical and less human than the last. He viewed his soldiers as a new species, one that didn't need a mother or a religion to survive. The factory was also the site where he researched the Sturm, a failed experiment with an airplane engine grafted onto a human torso, which served as a guard for the facility's deeper levels. Heisenberg's factory was a testament to his engineering genius and his utter lack of morality. He treated human bodies like spare parts, stripping away their identity to create a force that could challenge a goddess. He intended to use Rosemary Winters as the ultimate power source for his army, believing that her unique connection to the Megamycete could be harnessed like a battery. The factory was the most modern threat in the village, a vision of what would happen if the biohazard world embraced the industrial military complex. It was the site of the final showdown between the old world of Miranda's myths and the new world of Heisenberg's machines. When Ethan Winters finally reached the heart of the factory, he wasn't just fighting a lord. He was fighting the very concept of a biological industrial apocalypse, a future built on a foundation of gears, mold, and iron. Part 21. Miranda meets Oswell Spencer. In the early 1950s, the isolated valley played host to a visitor whose arrival would inadvertently set the course for global history. A young, ambitious medical student named Oswell E. Spencer. Having lost his way during a hiking expedition in the mountains, Spencer stumbled into the village and was taken in by Mother Miranda. At the time, Miranda was already decades into her research, and in the young Spencer, she found a rare intellectual equal. She took him on as a protege, sharing her profound discoveries regarding the Megamycete and the transformative power of the mold. She showed him how biology could be rewritten, and how death could be cheated through the integration of human consciousness into a cellular network. To Spencer, Miranda was a revelation. She was the living proof that a new world order could be built not on politics, but on the evolution of the human species through biological means. However, as their collaboration deepened, a fundamental ideological split emerged between the mentor and the student. Miranda was a woman of singular, localized focus. Her entire motivation was the resurrection of her daughter, Ava. She viewed the Megamycete as a tool for a private, personal miracle, and had no interest in the world beyond the mountain peaks. Spencer, conversely, possessed a vision that was terrifyingly vast. He saw Miranda's Black God as the blueprint for a global transformation. He didn't want to save one person. He wanted to become a god himself and force the entire human race through a filter of artificial evolution. This disagreement eventually led to their parting. Spencer left the village, carrying with him the inspiration he needed to find his own progenitor virus in Africa, and eventually found the Umbrella Corporation. The legacy of their meeting is etched into the very stones of the village. The iconic umbrella logo, which would one day become a symbol of global terror, was actually derived from the ancient four-winged crest Spencer saw in the village's altar. In his farewell letter to Miranda, Spencer acknowledged her as his primary inspiration, even as he critiqued her limited ambitions. This connection reframes the entire Resident Evil timeline. The horrors of Raccoon City, the T-virus, and the global biohazard outbreaks were all, in a sense, the distant echoes of a mourning mother's research in a remote Romanian valley. Miranda was the silent architect of the 20th century's greatest biological threats, a woman who taught the world's most dangerous man that the flesh was merely clay waiting to be molded. Part 22. The Connections and Eveline. As the 20th century drew to a close, and Miranda's search for a perfect vessel continued to stall, she began to look outside the valley for new data and resources. She established a clandestine partnership with a criminal syndicate known as the Connections, a group that specialized in the development and sale of biological weaponry. In exchange for samples of the Megamycete and her extensive research notes, the Connections provided Miranda with modern laboratory equipment and access to global genetic databases. This partnership led to the creation of the E-series bioweapon, the most famous result being the E001 subject, known as Eveline. Eveline was designed to use a refined strain of the mold, now called the Megamycete, to control the minds of her enemies and create families of infected hosts. Miranda monitored the Eveline project with a cold, critical eye, but she ultimately deemed it a failure. While Eveline possessed incredible power, she suffered from a fatal biological flaw, rapid aging. Miranda watched as the girl she had hoped might be a vessel for Eva withered into an elderly woman in a matter of years. To Miranda, Eveline was just another failed vessel, a piece of faulty technology that lacked the stability required for a permanent resurrection. However, the data gathered from the Eveline project, specifically the way the mold interacted with the Winters family during the incident in Dulvey, Louisiana, provided Miranda with the final piece of the puzzle. She realized that the daughter of Ethan and Mia Winters, a child born of two mold-infected parents, might possess the unique genetic resilience she had been searching for 100 years. The link between the village and the events of Resident Evil 7 is a direct line of biological succession. The mold that terrorized the Baker family was a direct descendant of the Black God beneath Miranda's feet. By sharing her research with the Connections, Miranda inadvertently set the stage for her own downfall, as it was this transaction that brought Ethan Winters into her sphere of influence. She viewed the world of global bioterrorism with indifference, seeing it only as a source of information for her private obsession. She didn't care about the lives Eveline destroyed. She only cared that the E-series had failed to give her Eva back. This callousness would eventually lead to the destruction of everything she had built, as the father created by her own research would soon arrive at her gates to settle the debt. Part 23. February 2021. The Village Falls. The final days of the village began in February 2021, when Mother Miranda initiated her cleaning of the valley to prepare for the ultimate ceremony. Realizing that her time with Rosemary Winters had arrived, she no longer had any use for the villagers she had protected for a century. She unleashed the lichens upon the population, turning the peaceful streets into a slaughterhouse. This was not an act of malice, but of cold, administrative efficiency. To Miranda, the villagers were merely lab equipment that needed to be sterilized before the final experiment. As the village burned, Ethan Winters arrived, a man driven by a desperate, ordinary love that Miranda's clinical mind could not comprehend. In a single, violent night, Ethan systematically dismantled the power structure that had ruled the valley for generations. Ethan's rampage through the domains of the Four Lords was a masterclass in survival, but it also served to break the biological and social seals that kept the Megamycete contained. By killing Alcina Dimitrescu, Donna Beneviento, Salvatore Moreau, and Carl Heisenberg, Ethan inadvertently removed the limiters that Miranda had placed on the valley. Each lord's death released a surge of mold energy back into the soil, feeding the Black God and accelerating the start of the ceremony. While Ethan believed he was winning, he was actually following Miranda's script, clearing away the discarded toys so that she could focus entirely on the rebirth of her daughter. The village was reduced to rubble and ash. The centuries of culture and faith evaporated in the heat of a modern biohazard conflict. The fall of the village was also the moment of the great betrayal. The villagers who had worshipped Miranda for decades died screaming her name, realizing too late that their mother was the one who had opened the gates for the wolves. The social contract of the valley was revealed to be a lie, a predator-prey relationship disguised as a religion. By the time Chris Redfield and his Hound Wolf squad moved in to secure the perimeter, the village was already a ghost town. The history of the settlers, the tradition of the wine, and the legacy of the noble houses were all being erased by the very power that had created them. The village didn't just fall, it was liquidated, a century of life sacrificed for a few moments of a dead girl's laughter. Part 24. Miranda's Final Gambit. The climax of the tragedy took place at the very heart of the valley, within the pulsating core of the Megamycete itself. Having successfully captured Rosemary Winters and divided her into 4 purified flasks of biological material, Miranda initiated the final ceremony. Her plan was to use the massive processing power of the Black God to reconstruct Eva's consciousness and implant it into Rose's body. As the mold surged and the ground shook, Miranda stood at the altar of her own making, believing she was finally at the end of her century-long journey. She was prepared to overwrite Rose's existence entirely, seeing the infant not as a person, but as the perfect vessel she had been promised by the stars. However, Miranda's gambit failed, because she fundamentally underestimated the strength of the modern mold and the human will. Rosemary Winters was not a passive container. She was the daughter of Ethan Winters, a man whose own biological makeup had been rewritten by the Megamycete into something resilient and unique. When Miranda attempted to initiate the transfer, she found that she could not suppress Rose's own consciousness. Furthermore, Ethan's intervention, resurrected by the mold one final time, distracted Miranda at the critical moment of synchronization. The ceremony turned into a chaotic struggle for biological dominance. Miranda, realizing her dream was slipping away, lost her composure and mutated into her final, unstable form, a towering, multi-winged manifestation of the Black God's rage. The battle between Ethan and Miranda was the final collision between 2 different kinds of love. Miranda's obsessive, regressive love for the dead, and Ethan's selfless, protective love for the living. Ethan's victory was not just a physical one. It was a rejection of Miranda's entire philosophy. By destroying Miranda, Ethan broke the link between the Megamycete and its human avatar. To ensure the threat was truly ended, Ethan stayed behind to detonate an N2 explosive charge at the core of the Black God. The resulting explosion didn't just kill Miranda, it vaporized the Megamycete and the entire mountain basin. The Black God was silenced. The Library of Souls was burned to the ground, and the century of shadows was finally brought to an end by a father who refused to let his daughter become a ghost. Part 25. What survived? In the freezing dawn following the explosion, the valley was a crater of ash and silence, yet several key elements of the nightmare survived the fire. Chris Redfield and the Hound Wolf Squad successfully evacuated Mia Winters and the infant Rosemary, but they left behind a landscape filled with unanswered questions. The most prominent of these was the fate of the Duke, the mysterious, gargantuan merchant who had aided Ethan throughout his journey, disappeared without a trace as the village fell. His origins remain one of the greatest mysteries of the Romanian incident. Some theories suggest he was a failed lord who found a way to maintain his independence, while others believe he was a sentient manifestation of the Megamycete's desire for commerce and data exchange. He left no body and no records, a ghost of the market who vanished back into the mist. Furthermore, the physical destruction of the Megamycete did not mean the end of its biological legacy. While the core in the village was destroyed, the data it had shared with the connections and the influence it had on Oswell, Spencer meant that the mold was now a permanent part of the global bioweapon landscape. The BSAA's subsequent investigation into the ruins revealed that the contamination had seeped deep into the bedrock, and while the consciousness of the Black God was dead, its cellular blueprints remained a prize for any organization willing to dig through the rubble. The survivors of the village, the few who managed to flee before the Lycan attack, were left as refugees of a war they didn't understand, carrying the trauma of the mother in their blood and their memories. Perhaps the most significant survivor was the truth about the BSAA itself. During the chaos of the village's end, Chris Redfield discovered that the organization he helped found was now deploying biological soldiers, infected humanoids used as disposable shock troops. This revelation suggested that the very institutions built to fight bioterrorism had become infected by the same hubris that drove Mother Miranda. The village was gone, but the rot had moved into the light. The mission was a tactical success, but a moral catastrophe, leaving Chris and his team as rogue agents in a world where the line between the heroes and the monsters had become as thin as a mold spore. Part 26. The Village's Legacy. The legacy of the village is one of the darkest chapters in human history. A century-long experiment that proved how easily humanity can be subverted by the promise of resurrection and the power of biology. Mother Miranda's work did not die in the explosion, it evolved. The data recovered from her laboratory and the remnants of the Soldat project have influenced a new generation of bioweapon development, shifting the focus from simple viruses to complex, consciousness-based organisms. The village served as the ultimate proof of concept for feudal bioterrorism, a model of control that many shadow organizations are now seeking to replicate in other isolated parts of the world. The Black God is gone, but the idea of a biological network that can record and control human memory is the new frontier of the arms race. Rosemary Winters stands as the living embodiment of this legacy. As she grows into adulthood, monitored by Chris Redfield and the remnants of the government's biohazard task forces, she possesses powers that dwarf those of the Four Lords. She is a biological entity that should not exist, a girl who carries the genetic memory of the Megamycete and the resilience of the Winters bloodline. She is the daughter of the village, a person born from a century of screams, yet she represents the only hope for a future where that power can be used for something other than murder. Her struggle to remain human while carrying the power of a god is the final act of the village's story, a legacy of grief that she must transform into a legacy of protection. Ultimately, The ruins of the village serve as a monument to the dangers of unchecked obsession. Mother Miranda's attempt to bring back one girl nearly cost the world its soul. The empty houses and the scorched earth of the valley are a reminder that the past cannot be resurrected without destroying the future. The village is now a restricted zone, a place where the wind still carries the faint, metallic scent of blood and the earthy smell of mold. It is a cautionary tale for the year 2026 and beyond, a warning that the Black God is always waiting beneath the soil, ready to listen to the prayers of those who cannot let go. The history of the village is over, but its secrets are still being whispered in the labs of the BSAA and the dreams of a girl named Rose, ensuring that the shadows of the Romanian peaks will haunt the world for generations to come.